The Warriors experience is about to change forever, with the series taking a detour into some of the greatest platforms and franchises available. Dynasty Warriors Unleashed is on its way to mobile platforms. Fire Emblem Warriors will be hitting the Nintendo Switch and new 3DS consoles this year. Dynasty Warriors itself is approaching its 9th installment. Even Musou Stars, which compiles the best of this franchise and its many spin-offs, will be launching before long. It begs the question of why this series has struck such a strong chord with everyone. This is quite a reasonable question as well, as these games are surprisingly repetitive in nature. Some would argue that the Dynasty Warriors experience lacks the necessary qualities to be as captivating, and as a fan, I still completely understand that stance. Now, I only stepped into the world of Warriors back in 2011 with the launch of Samurai Warriors Chronicles for the Nintendo 3DS, and yet still, I've been able to be captured by different features within many of the titles. It's time to take a look at what elements of these games open them up to be so incredibly diverse while remaining inherently similar. It's time to see why repetition is forgivable when you place it in the context of Warriors. The Warriors games essentially give us some insight into where hack and slash really took shape as a genre. Horde combat is the name of the game, as players must move in pursuit of certain checkpoints throughout large maps and fight their way through literal thousands of enemy units and opposing factions as they aim to eliminate the enemy and protect their allies. These games take many shapes. There's Dynasty Warriors, the original series that recounts tales of Chinese history in a way that truly encapsulates players in a romanticized and captivating narrative. Then there's Samurai Warriors, which is the same for Japanese history. Breaking off from those are the Empire's titles, which offer more strategy elements similar to Romance of the Three Kingdoms or Nobunaga's Ambition, which both of these games are actually based on. Then there are the Warriors Orochi titles, which bring the best of both worlds as well as just a little bit extra, including the likes of Ninja Gaiden's Ryu Hayabusa and Dead or Alive's colorful cast. Finally, there are the other Warriors titles, which are generally adaptations of other popular franchises like The Legend of Zelda, Fire Emblem, Gundam, One Piece, and many more. For the purposes of this video, we'll be primarily focusing on the combat of these games, with a brief exploration of some narrative elements. From Dynasty Warriors to Hyrule Warriors, and so on, these games all have identical controls across the board, give or take one or two minor differences between installments and obviously across platforms. You have one button for light attacks and one for heavy, a button for jumping or dashing, and a button to use your special or Musou attack. One of the shoulder buttons will be used to guard, while the other is used to power up your weapon or activate a secret technique. While guarding, using the analog stick will allow for strafing. One button on the directional pad can be used in both Dynasty and Samurai Warriors to summon a horse, which will allow you to move faster across the map. Players will essentially have the goal of defeating the enemy commander or boss of each map. In order to do so, players will have to master tactical formations and travel throughout the map during a well-paced and organized campaign on a given territory. Most progression is done through the defeat of massive hordes of enemies. There are three types of enemy units. Regular units, who primarily function as unintelligent cannon fodder. Then, there are enemy officers, who have names and offer a slightly greater challenge. Finally, there are Musou characters, which are basically just like you. They have the same weapons and special character designs, moves, and powers alike. They make up the crux of the challenge in these games. In the likes of Hyrule Warriors, there are giant enemies and whatnot, but for the most part, you'll be fighting enemies that look and fight just like you. There are also guard captains who protect strongholds that enemy units will spawn from, and defense captains who protect gates. You've got to destroy these guys if you want to move forward and arrive at your final confrontation with the enemy commander. Defeat conditions in these games are interesting. Above all else, don't die, but that one's kind of obvious. Don't let enemies kill your crew or occupy your main camps. Survival is easy if you approach the game with some confidence. We're hitting squish a little early this time, aren't we? We simply have to. Anyone who remembers my Monkey Ball video knows that when discussing game feel for that game, Dynasty Warriors was the game I used to explain what the concept of game feel is. Reasonably so, the game masters the concept of using every possible element, such as timing, particle effects, movement, screen shake, and so on, to create a real simulation of weight, intensity, strength, and impact. These are crucial to making sure the combat feels fun and somewhat real despite having surreal elements. The ability to string together light and heavy attacks for incredibly powerful combinations gives the strong element of versatility and contributes to the varying weight of every attack. The varying weight aspect is only complemented by the different enemy unit types, which put up a varying amount of resistance depending on their status. Some will even guard and counter your attacks, which feels more effective depending on the amount of momentum behind an attack you use. Then, there are these clashes that take place every time two attacks of the same weight are done at the same time. Like if you were to use a strong attack while your opponent's doing a heavy one as well, you'll be put into a clash where you're required to button mash at an incredible rate to fill up a meter, which will trigger a special attack or allow you to break your opponent's guard. These are obviously some incredibly well executed concepts, but they alone aren't enough to make players identify with the Warriors' experience, and they certainly aren't enough to justify how frequently new installments of the game come out. But that can be justified, and within these next two sections, I will highlight what I would label the two strongest elements of the entire game. Now in my notes, I actually have this section labeled as narrative with a question mark, as it's definitely not consistent from one game to the next. But for the sake of this section in this video, I'd like to focus on what I consider to be the two strongest games in the franchise, based on the way they execute narrative. This would be Samurai Warriors Chronicles, which was the first game I played, and Warriors Orochi 3. These games both handle story in an incredibly different way from one another as well. Chronicles was the first of its kind. It launched exclusively on the Nintendo 3DS and allowed players to create their own character and live through a very unique rendition of the Warring States era of Japan. The game allows you, as your custom character, to master your own preferred weapon style, battle your way through many chapters, and befriend various warriors of the age, helping them through the best and worst phases of their lives, and in some specific cases, their deaths as well. The way these elements translate over the battle are simply marvelous. Your relationships with certain characters can change the way they speak to you or interact with you, whether you meet them on the battlefield as a friend or a foe. A simple confrontation line might be replaced with a character's concern as to why they have to do battle with you, based on the developed relationship you have. On top of this, various events are shown throughout the game that give you insight into the philosophy of warriors preceding and following some of the greatest battles in our world's history. The emotions are real, and the game does a great job of removing the typical hero-villain notions commonly affiliated with action games. Nobunaga Oda's beast-like nature is a common point of interest in previous games, but only in this title is it truly explored. His philosophy, his reasoning, even for his more upsetting methods, gives you a chance to understand that a world at war is not so simple. The way the narrative plays out is also interesting, as a lot of the game-changing plot points take place during battles. This includes incredibly important character deaths and much more. Because of the different missions a player gets in each battle, it's easy to follow varying paths and witness some slightly different outcomes. You absolutely feel influential as your actions impact parts of history the further the game goes. Now, fast forward a few years to Warriors Orochi 3, and you have a far more linear narrative experience about warriors trying to defeat the mythical Orochi. From Achilles to Yukimura, Lubu to Joan of Arc, this game offers one of the largest rosters in gaming's, but not without a little bit of extra work. Players must travel to different locations and timelines in Chinese, Japanese, and sometimes fictional history in order to retrieve different units who died in the battle with the Hydra at the beginning of the game. While this story isn't exactly the most unique or original, or even well told, it's still a good soiree into the unique dynamic of crossover elements in one of these games. It also has defined good and evil, which isn't necessarily common in the series outside of Lubu. It's weird and very different from other installments of the series, and yet it still manages to maintain the heart of a Warriors game, focusing on bringing us those epic key battles with shocking developments and diverging timelines. Even still, these narrative pieces don't make the strongest contribution to the love people hold for these games. That, I believe, comes from a psychological element deeply rooted in the core design of the Warriors franchise. One interesting aspect about the Warriors titles is their significant lack of strong opposition or really challenge in any capacity. It's rather the way they make players feel emotionally as they do certain actions that give the sense of challenge and conquest as a result. These games lack the sort of sentimentality that I discussed when talking about emotional provocation in the Paper Mario video. This is a different type of emotional manipulation that centers itself in an environment of pure dedicated combat and exhilaration. This game appeals to a very human desire, one to feel important and impactful. It's not a unique or rare desire, and it's very easy to achieve under the right circumstances. That's why the Warriors games load up their arenas with massive hordes of enemies, yet you're the only one who can seemingly fight well in this battle. It's the reason why you're given allied units who lack any sort of real strength, right? They give you a bunch of people to depend on you. In fact, the game takes extra special care to remind you every time an allied unit is feeling a little weak. Warriors titles love to give you that swoop in and save the day feeling, and while a game where your strength is insurmountable may seem boring initially, triggering feelings like the aforementioned one can really send players on a power trip. It's not about slaughtering hundreds or thousands in this bloody spree of murder. In fact, the titles take special care not to be particularly gory. The pleasure of these games shines through in that they allow you to play a vital role in a big setting, the ultimate role even. That's why they create such visually impressive combat sequences. Hyrule Warriors has its incredible boss fights, creating a real David and Goliath feeling as epic confrontations of huge size create a simulation of very real power, especially when you're playing as smaller characters with these epic finishers. On top of this, when boss characters first arrive in those games, they start crushing your allies in camps. There's a real sense of urgency as you approach those large foes, and it never leaves your mind that you are the only person capable of standing against them. The cannon fodder enemies, the standard units, they only serve as decoration. They're not really meant to be opposition, just something you can do as you cross large sections on the map. They exist purely to add more weight to your attacks and add to your KO counter. It's truly a brilliant strategy, but it does sometimes get misconstrued as the game's being too easy. Now, with that being said, I'm not saying the developers are particularly good at scaling difficulty. As you increase difficulty in the game, even the Chaos mode, which is the most difficult form, you simply take more damage. They scale up the power of the enemies. The AI doesn't improve any. Though I suppose having AI that's too complex and like pathfinding that is sort of too detailed could interfere with the actual thousands of enemy units that are constantly present on the map. Essentially, players are given an opportunity to play superhero in the best way possible. Combine that with genuinely good combat and some of the most quality variations I've ever seen in a game, and you have a recipe for a series with true longevity. With tweaks to the combat between each installment, numerous extra characters, story missions, perspectives, character customization, and so on, it only takes a little bit of extra emotional manipulation to make a series like this last. In hacking away at these notes, I found my position on the individual series slashed in a few different directions. My love of Samurai Warriors led me to believe that the narrative elements of these games could single-handedly take credit for the success of the franchise. Then, Hyrule Warriors changed my position. It made me realize that if you slice out the strong game design elements, you're not left with a lot of meat. Aesthetic, decisions, squish, game feel, and the layout of the game, these qualities can't be overlooked. Cutting to my final thoughts, and by extension my last pun, I'd like to bring your attention back to Dynasty Warriors Empires. These games, which as I previously stated, used a lot of the tactical elements of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, really help you come to terms with the gravity of these games. Battles of this style, when fought with genuine purpose, are among the greatest experiences possible in this medium. Thanks, Game Roomies, for traveling along with me through another critical analysis, this time of an entire franchise. Yeah, I'm fearless. For more discussion-based content, head over to Mustafa's Game Room or check out the podcast. More news on that coming soon, by the way. Thanks again for watching, and come back soon for more from The Game Room.